A few days ago, I told you guys to send me your artwork. And you actually did. Like, a lot of you did. So now I'm sitting here with a collection of your pieces, and today, I'll be enhancing them using my own rendering techniques. But a quick disclaimer before we start. This is all just for fun. I'm not here to tell you what you should be doing with your art. This is more like what I would do if this was my piece. So take what works for you, ignore what doesn't, and don't fight me in the comments. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. The first thing that caught my attention in this artwork is the shadow work, specifically these overlapping shadows here. Now, I know in real life you can get complex shadow interactions like this in certain lighting conditions, but in this case, the lighting is pretty clearly coming from one main direction. So what's happening here is a bit visually confusing. The character has his own cast shadow, but it's also affecting the shadow already sitting on the environment. So instead of everything feeling like it belongs to the same lighting environment, it starts to split the scene into different lighting rules, which breaks the cohesion a little. So what I'm going to do is simplify it. I'm going to merge these shadow values together into one consistent tone, so everything behaves like it belongs under the same light. Also, part of his hand falls into the shadowed area, so I'm going to let that sit properly in shadow as well. Now I'm going to match the character's shadow values with the rest of the environment because the light here is actually pretty strong and direct, but the character's shadow doesn't quite match that intensity. So I'm reinforcing it, making it a bit darker, and slightly sharper where it needs to feel more defined. While I'm at it, I'm also shaping the form a little more. Since the clothing looks pretty tight, I want the silhouette and structure of the body to read better through it, especially around the chest and abdominal area. Just pushing the form so it feels more present in the lighting. And I'll be honest, I've only drawn abs like 4 times in my entire art life. I usually lean more towards slimmer, flatter builds for male characters, so this isn't exactly my comfort zone. So I'm not gonna pretend I'm teaching anything here. I'm also adding a bit more shadow to his arm here just to push that 3D feel a little more and match the definition we added to the torso. And I also darken his other arm, just to make sure it matches the same shadow intensity as everything else around it, so the depth stays consistent and nothing feels like it's floating separately. Next up, these papers. They've still got some overlapping shadows going on, and since this whole area is already in shadow, I'm just going to simplify it and remove the extra layer. This part was actually kinda tricky though. There's a lot of tiny texture details here, and this piece is very detailed overall, so I'm trying not to bulldoze over all that work. If you notice here, there's this straight line running across his pants. But shadow and lighting usually wrap around form. They bend, they follow volume, they don't just cut straight across like that. So this looks like it's sitting on top of the fabric instead of following it. I'm going to adjust that and let it bend with the shape instead. I'm mostly working from intuition here, since I don't really have a strong reference for this exact fold behavior. While I'm here, I'm also refining the creases. Nothing wrong with the original ones, I just want to emphasize where the fabric pulls and folds. And I'm deepening a few of them slightly, just to give the material more weight and dimension overall. Next, I'm adding a second layer of shadow under the character just to properly anchor him into the environment. Ideally, this kind of contact shadow wouldn't be this sharp. It would usually be a bit softer. But visually, I don't think it's hurting anything here. It reads clearly, it supports the form, and it helps the depth. Sometimes it's fine not to overthink it too much. If it looks good, then it works. And then on the chin, we've got this shadow sitting across it like a flat shape, but the chin is a rounded form, so I want the shadow to follow that curve instead. Just wrapping it slightly so it feels more dimensional. Last thing I'm doing is adding a few final details. A bit more subsurface scattering on the skin, just to bring back some warmth and life into the character. I'm also reworking the scars on his arm. They got a bit lost earlier while I was adding the shadows, so I'm bringing those back in. And with that, we're done. This is the final result. Here's the before. And the after. This is our first artwork fixed. And honestly, I'm really happy with how it turned out. It was already a lovely piece to begin with, so I was a bit cautious about overdoing anything or not doing it justice. But yeah, this was fun. Moving on to the next artwork. When I first saw this artwork, I got so giddy. Like my brain immediately started running with ideas. There's just so much potential in this piece. The artist mentioned that the background is supposed to be a waterfall. And yeah, you can kind of see it. But with the flat, dark blue solid background right now, it ends up feeling more like the water's just existing in an empty room. And with these two majestic, peaceful characters. Unacceptable. Let's give them a space that actually does them justice. Something a bit more immersive, a bit more breathtaking. We're gonna start with this veil. It's already nice, but I feel like it can be pushed a bit further. These two have this regal, almost princely vibe, and the fabric right now feels a little too plain for that energy. It kind of undersells them. Especially since we're pairing it with something like a waterfall. The whole scene has the potential to feel really ethereal. So I want the details to match that. First thing I'm doing is increasing the transparency of the veil. Right now it's almost solid. It ends up reading more like a light blanket instead. I want it to feel airy, like light can actually pass through it. Just enough transparency to give it that soft, weightless quality so the characters feel more open, and less wrapped up in it. What I'm doing here is adding darker patches onto the veil to push the transparency. Because the more transparent something is, the more you start seeing what's behind it, and in this case, it's that solid dark blue background. Which actually makes this part pretty straightforward to work with. I'm just reusing that same blue, then lowering the opacity so it sits softly into the fabric instead of overpowering it. It's still rough right now, of course. This is just the base pass. I'll refine it once everything is in place. While I'm at it, I also made the light a bit more defined. I tend to work better when the light direction is very clear, because it makes placing shadows way more consistent later on. I like to reinforce that main light source first, then building everything else around it. I'm not gonna go into full detail on how I draw the veils here, because otherwise this video would never end. But right now, I'm just adding some pattern work into them. Again, the idea is to match the overall elegance of these two characters. A plain fabric kind of undersells that energy, so adding something like lace helps push that more expensive, detailed feel. It also just helps the piece feel less empty visually. Like there's more intention and richness in the design. After that, I move into refining. Starting with the fabric at the back. I'm just adding a few extra details here to really sell the material. Things like folds, subtle creases, and how the cloth naturally drapes. Since I don't really have a direct reference for this exact angle, I'm mostly working off intuition here, so if anything feels slightly off, that's why. But the goal is just to make the fabric feel more believable and less flat in those areas. I'm gonna wrap up the veil here pretty quickly, so we can move on to the rest of the piece. You can just watch this part in fast forward. Next, I start adding shadows onto the characters to build up some depth. I'm leaning toward a slightly bluish tone here, so it stays consistent with the overall color of the piece. At this point, the veil isn't fully done yet. I'm kind of working back and forth between elements as I go. Okay, I think the fabric is in a pretty good place for now. I might come back and tweak a few things later, but it's solid enough to move on. I'm gonna shift my focus to the characters now. Starting with the yellow-haired one. I'm boosting the saturation of his hair a bit. Right now, even with the veil being more transparent, the hair isn't really coming through as clearly as it could. It feels a little muted, especially with how strong the lighting is in this scene. So I'm pushing the saturation. Not just under the veil but across the whole hair also, just to help it stand out more and respond better to the lighting. Then, using an overlay layer, I add a soft glow over the lighting. Just to push that light a bit further. And give the characters a subtle, glowy aura. Nothing too heavy though. Just enough to make everything feel a bit more luminous. For the second character, I wasn't entirely sure if the hair was meant to be white or slightly purple, so instead of pushing the color too much, I played it a bit safer. I focused more on the shape instead. Letting the hair drape more naturally across the thighs he's resting on. It might not be perfectly realistic, but it adds a bit more movement and detail, and helps sell the softness of the hair overall. Finally, I can shift focus to the background. I start by adding some foliage elements around the scene, since waterfalls are usually surrounded by a bit of plant life. In my head, this place feels like it's near a cave system. Stone floor, scattered bushes, thick patches of greenery and just a few larger trees here and there. I'm keeping the shapes pretty simple for now, since most of this will be softened and blurred later anyway. At the same time, I'm also redefining the waterfall itself. Right now it's a bit too abstract, like floating blue shapes, so I'm carving it back into something that reads more clearly as falling water. Just enough to sell the motion without over-detailing it. Lastly, I added some final touches. A bit more glowy lighting to really push that dreamy atmosphere. I also painted in the foliage that's supposed to sit behind the veil, because it wasn't really visible. And of course, sparkles. Because apparently I physically cannot stop myself from adding sparkles whenever something starts looking magical. I actually got really excited at this stage because everything was finally starting to come together. And finally, this is the result. This is before. And this is after. And with that, I think this is the end of the video. I honestly wanted to do even more artworks because there were so many amazing submissions, but if I kept going this video would probably become a movie. Maybe next time. Huge shout out to all the artists who trusted me enough to let me invade their artwork. And hopefully, somewhere in between my questionable explanations and random rambling, you managed to pick up a few useful tips here and there. Also, if you want a chance to have your artwork fixed by me in the future, feel free to drop them in my Discord server. I am always in need of more beautiful art to obsess over. And yeah, that's all from me. Have a nice day,